April 19, 1979. Rome, Vatican City. At the heart of Catholicism, surrounded by stone walls older than modern intelligence services, a wanted bomb maker believed he was untouchable. He crossed borders without passports, hid behind religion, and trusted that no foreign agent would dare follow him inside the Vatican. But for 9 weeks, 4 men in black cassocks had already done the impossible. They learned Latin prayers, memorized liturgy, and answered to false names under Operation Lazarus. And before the Easter bells finished ringing, sanctuary would collapse, and a global red line would be crossed. Ibrahim Khalil was born in the early 1940s in what would soon become contested territory. The Arab-Israeli Wars of 1948 displaced his family twice before he turned 10. By age 17, Khalil had developed the one skill that would define his operational value. He could build compact explosives that detonated exactly when intended. Unlike ideologues who preached revolution, Khalil practiced it through engineering. His devices were elegant in their simplicity, cruel in their efficiency. By the mid-1970s, Western intelligence agencies had compiled a technical profile of Khalil's work. His signature was consistency. Airlines operating European routes found devices in cargo holds with identical timer mechanisms. Embassy mailrooms across 3 continents intercepted packages bearing his hallmark construction, components sourced from civilian electronics, assembled to bypass metal detectors common at the time. Associates described him as methodical, never theatrical. He built bombs the way a watchmaker assembled timepieces, with precision that eliminated variables. Intelligence services had tracked Khalil for 6 years by 1978. The Mossad maintained a file designated Target Index 734, updated monthly with movement patterns and known associates. He was not a commander. He gave no speeches. But his survival meant operational infrastructure remained intact. Remove Khalil, and planned attacks would stall for lack of technical expertise. This calculation made him a priority target under Israeli preemption doctrine, a framework that authorized kinetic action when arrests proved impossible and diplomatic options yielded nothing. The problem was sanctuary. By late 1978, Khalil had cultivated relationships with Catholic intermediaries sympathetic to Palestinian self-determination. These contacts provided him access to Vatican City, a sovereign entity occupying 109 acres in central Rome. The Vatican maintained diplomatic neutrality recognized by 183 nations. No foreign intelligence service held jurisdiction inside its borders. No extradition treaty applied. Surveillance required consent that would never be granted. Khalil understood this protection and exploited it systematically. He crossed into Vatican territory freely, knowing arrest warrants meant nothing beyond the walls. Rome itself offered additional cover. The city was porous, crowded with tourists and pilgrims, politically fragmented between Italian authority and Vatican sovereignty. Khalil moved through this complexity like water finding cracks in stone. Intelligence intercepts from December 1978 reveal him discussing logistics with a Syrian diplomatic courier. Analysts noted nothing operationally urgent in the conversation. He mentioned visiting his sister in Beirut that summer. He complained about Rome's winter rain. When the operation occurred 4 months later, that sister would learn of his death through unofficial channels, delayed by 72 hours while governments debated disclosure protocols. Israeli doctrine in the late Cold War era followed a principle called strategic defense through disruption. The logic was straightforward. Preempt threats before they materialized into casualties. This philosophy justified operations on foreign soil when host nations either could not or would not act. Vatican City presented a unique obstacle within this framework. An overt raid would trigger international crisis involving the Holy See. Diplomatic pressure risked exposure of intelligence sources. Traditional surveillance methods failed inside stone buildings, constructed centuries before electronic monitoring existed. The operation that would become Lazarus III solved this problem through radical adaptation. Instead of overwhelming force, planners chose invisibility through ordinariness. The concept was deep cover impersonation, an approach rarely attempted for kinetic missions due to sustained exposure risk. Operatives would become what they hunted, moving through religious spaces by adopting religious identity. The obstacles were formidable: linguistic mastery of Latin and Italian, credible knowledge of Jesuit history and Vatican bureaucracy, psychological discipline to maintain false identity under prolonged observation. One inconsistency in liturgical timing, one mispronounced prayer, and the entire operation would collapse. Despite these challenges, planners identified an opportunity window. Intelligence confirmed Khalil had scheduled an Easter week meeting with a Syrian diplomat inside Vatican grounds. The date was fixed. Crowds would be massive. Over 300,000 pilgrims flooding St. Peter's Square for papal blessing. Ambient noise would reach levels that masked sound. And if the opportunity passed, Khalil would vanish again into networks spanning 3 continents. The authorization to proceed came in January 1979. Signed by a deputy director whose name remains redacted in declassified summaries. 4 operatives were selected through a process that examined psychological profiles as much as tactical skills. None have been publicly identified. Each brought specific aptitudes: native-level linguistic ability, experience in sustained undercover work, and what case files described as narrative discipline, the capacity to inhabit false identity without cognitive drift. Their mission designation, Lazarus III, referenced resurrection through disguise, the 3rd operation under that cryptonym since 1974. Training consumed 3 months, conducted at a facility outside Tel Aviv that simulated Vatican architectural layouts. The operatives learned Jesuit institutional history, focusing on scholarly traditions that justified presence in Vatican archives. They memorized the structure of Catholic Mass, including the precise timing of liturgical elements. The communion bells rang for approximately 90 seconds during standard Easter services, a duration measured through recordings obtained from prior years. Latin pronunciation was drilled until accent markers disappeared. Each man could recite prayers with the cadence of lifelong clergy. Cover identities were constructed around Jesuit scholarship researching early church manuscripts. This legend provided access to Vatican libraries and credible reason for extended presence. Real academic institutions were referenced in forged letters of introduction. Credentials matched Vatican archival systems well enough to survive casual verification. Cassocks were custom-tailored in Rome using black wool fabric, not synthetic materials that would mark them as outsiders. Stitching matched period-accurate clerical garments down to buttonhole spacing. Infrastructure was established through compartmentalized cells. Safe apartments were rented near Borgo Pio, the neighborhood adjacent to Vatican walls. Dead drops were labeled as prayer materials, devotional texts, with hollowed interiors for message transfer. Surveillance teams rotated every 48 hours to prevent pattern recognition by Italian security services monitoring the area. Informants inside Rome's expatriate Palestinian community were recruited through cash payments, $2,000 per confirmed sighting of Khalil. These sources operated independently, unaware their information fed operational planning. Team structure followed cellular principles. 2 operatives maintained religious cover full-time, residing in assigned lodging and attending daily mass at designated churches. One operative served as external surveillance, tracking Khalil's movements outside Vatican territory. One handled logistics and exfiltration planning, maintaining vehicles and escape routes. No single operative knew the complete operational picture. Compartmentalization protected against compromise if any element was exposed. By early March 1979, all pieces were positioned. The operatives had established credible presence as visiting Jesuit scholars. Vatican archivists recognized them by sight. Swiss guards waved them through security checkpoints without secondary screening. What the Vatican staff didn't know was that each interaction was rehearsed, each gesture calculated to build trust that would be exploited when the moment arrived. Within 6 weeks, all elements would be in position. But first, one critical element needed resolution, confirming the exact location where Khalil would meet his Syrian contact. First contact was indirect, established through human intelligence assets cultivated over 18 months. A Palestinian expatriate working as a translator for Vatican administrative offices had accepted money to report unusual visitors. He didn't know his handlers were Israeli. He believed he was feeding information to a rival Palestinian faction settling internal scores. On March 7, 1979, at 14:30 hours, this source confirmed Khalil had entered Vatican City on foot through the St. Anne Gate, the northern entrance used by Vatican employees and authorized visitors. Khalil's routine followed consistent patterns. He arrived mid-morning, usually between 1000 and 1100 hours, blending with clergy and tourists moving through public areas. His preferred locations were side chapels, less guarded spaces where private conversations occurred naturally. These chapels offered symbolic safety, places where violence seemed unthinkable. Surveillance noted he carried no visible security, relying entirely on Vatican neutrality as protection. Complications emerged in the third week of March. Swiss guard duty schedules changed without announcement, altering access points at critical times. One operative was questioned by a Vatican archivist about credential specifics, a routine inquiry that became dangerous when the archivist mentioned verifying details with the issuing institution. The operative maintained composure, provided contact information for a controller posing as Jesuit administrative staff, and waited. Within 12 hours, forged verification was transmitted through legitimate channels. The archivist accepted the response. The operative's hands had trembled during the exchange. Physiological response noted in his post-operation debrief as evidence of stress approaching operational limits. Meanwhile, Khalil altered his meeting schedule twice in 4 days, suggesting heightened awareness or simply scheduled conflicts with his Syrian contact. Intelligence analysts monitoring communications intercepts couldn't determine which. Each change forced recalibration of positioning plans. The window for action was narrowing. Easter Sunday approached with fixed timing. If the opportunity passed, Khalil might not return for months. During the final week of March, one operative experienced what operational psychologists call legend drift, the dangerous blurring when false identity begins feeling more authentic than original self. He found himself automatically crossing himself when passing religious icons, a gesture unnecessary for the cover, but internalized through repetition. At night, he caught himself reciting Latin prayers without conscious intent. In the post-operation psychiatric evaluation, assessors noted this as evidence of deep immersion, but flagged it as psychological risk requiring monitoring. But the mission continued because alternatives didn't exist. The execution window opened through confirmed intelligence on April 15th. A communications intercept revealed Khalil would meet his Syrian diplomatic contact on Easter Sunday, April 19th, at 11:47 hours. The location was a side chapel near St. Peter's Basilica, specifically the Chapel of the Pietà, a space tourists visited but rarely occupied during peak Mass times. The meeting timing was deliberate, chosen to coincide with maximum crowd density when over 300,000 pilgrims would flood the surrounding areas for papal blessing. Noise would be overwhelming, movement constant, confusion inevitable. Sound could disappear into ambient chaos, and individuals could vanish into human currents flowing through the Vatican complex. It was the only moment where operational action became feasible within the constraints imposed by the target environment. April 18th, 1979. 2100 hours. The final operational briefing occurred in a safe apartment 300 meters from Vatican walls. No written materials were present. The team leader, identified in documents only as Handler 6, reviewed timing sequences verbally. Each operative confirmed understanding of individual responsibilities. The weapon selected was a compact 7.65mm pistol fitted with a suppressor manufactured specifically for this operation. The suppressor reduced muzzle report to approximately 120 decibels, a sound level masked entirely by church bells and crowd noise at close range. The pistol was concealed inside a prayer book, hollowed to precise depth. The binding reinforced to prevent visible sagging. X-ray screening at Vatican entrances focused on metal detection, not book interiors. The weapon would pass inspection if carried naturally, held like any devotional text a clergyman might carry. Total weight was 900 grams, distributed to feel like a standard hardcover volume. Escape routes had been mapped with redundancy. Primary exfiltration followed pedestrian paths through Borgo Santo Spirito to a waiting vehicle positioned 800 meters from the chapel. Secondary routes utilized Vatican gardens if primary paths were blocked, though this option required breaching low walls and accepting increased exposure time. Tertiary exfiltration involved immediate disappearance into crowd density, discarding cassocks and blending as civilian tourists. Each option had been physically rehearsed during pre-dawn hours when observation was minimal. April 19th, 1979. 0600 hours. Rome woke to clear weather, temperature forecasted to reach 18 degrees Celsius by midday. Ideal conditions for the massive crowds Vatican officials anticipated. The operatives attended separate early masses at different churches, maintaining cover protocols even as execution timing approached. One operative later described the surreal experience of taking communion while carrying authorization for killing. The cognitive dissonance of sacred ritual and planned violence occurring simultaneously. By 900 hours, over 200,000 pilgrims had begun gathering in St. Peter's Square. Vatican security focused on crowd control and preventing crush injuries in densely packed areas. Swiss guards maintained perimeter positions. Italian police monitored adjacent streets. No one searched for threats already inside the walls, threats that had spent 9 weeks becoming invisible through familiarity. 10:45 hours. 2 operatives entered Vatican City separately through different gates, both carrying the credentials that had been verified repeatedly over previous weeks. Guards recognized them, waved them through without secondary screening. They proceeded to predetermined positions near the Chapel of the Pietà, arriving separately to avoid appearance of coordination. 1100 hours. The first operative entered the chapel, genuflected toward the altar, and knelt in a pew, positioned with clear sight lines to the entrance. His cassock concealed the hollowed prayer book resting naturally in his lap. Ambient sound levels in the chapel measured approximately 70 decibels, a combination of tourist conversations and distant crowd noise filtering through stone walls. 11:30 hours. The second operative entered, moving to a position near a support pillar offering concealment and rapid exit access. He appeared to examine architectural details, behavior consistent with scholarly interest in Renaissance construction. Other visitors paid no attention. Clergy examining church architecture was unremarkable. 11:42 hours. Khalil arrived at the chapel entrance, alone as intelligence had predicted. He wore civilian clothing, dark trousers, and a jacket appropriate for church visit. His expression was calm. He believed absolutely in the neutrality of the space surrounding him. Faith in sanctuary cultivated through months of unmolested visits. What he didn't know was that the two clergymen already present had trained for this moment through 3,000 hours of preparation. 11:45 hours. The Syrian diplomat entered, a man identified in intelligence files as a commercial attaché with known connections to militant logistics networks. He and Khalil exchanged brief greetings, moved to a quiet corner of the chapel away from tourists examining Michelangelo's Pietà sculpture. Their conversation appeared routine, two acquaintances meeting in neutral territory. 11:46 hours. The operative kneeling in the pew rose slowly, the hollowed prayer book now open in his hands. Distance to target, under 2 meters. The weapon inside was already positioned, suppressor aligned with the book's spine, trigger accessible through a reinforced opening disguised as decorative binding. 11:47 hours. Across Vatican City, the communion bells began their 90-second sequence. Bronze clappers striking resonant metal in the pattern that had marked Catholic ritual for centuries. Sound waves propagated through stone corridors, amplified by architectural acoustics designed to carry liturgical music. In the chapel of the Pietà, ambient noise spiked above 95 decibels. At the second bell, the operative moved. 2 steps forward, the prayer book lifted slightly, angle calculated during hundreds of practice repetitions. 2 shots, center mass, fired in 1.2 seconds. The suppressor functioned exactly as specifications promised, reducing muzzle report to a sound indistinguishable from distant doors closing or furniture shifting. The 7.65 millimeter rounds struck Khalil in the thoracic cavity, penetrating lung, tissue and causing immediate pneumothorax. Khalil's body responded with physiological predictability. He collapsed backward, hands moving reflexively toward the wound sites. No scream emerged, air escaping through damaged lung tissue instead of vocal cords. The Syrian diplomat reacted with delayed comprehension, 3 seconds of frozen shock before he stumbled away from the falling body, his own survival instinct overriding any impulse to render aid. Elapsed time from first shot to Khalil's collapse, 4.6 seconds. The operative holding the weapon closed the prayer book, the pistol concealed again within hollowed pages. He turned and walked toward the chapel exit, pace measured to match the unhurried movement of clergy with no particular destination. Tourists near the Pietà sculpture continued their examination, unaware of the event occurring 30 meters away in the chapel's dimmer recesses. The second operative departed from his position near the pillar, exiting through a different doorway, merging into foot traffic moving through Vatican corridors. Cassocks provided perfect camouflage. Clergy moved constantly through Vatican spaces, and 2 more black-clad figures attracted zero attention. 11:49 hours. Both operatives had exited the chapel separately, taking different routes toward the primary exfiltration point. The Syrian diplomat finally approached Khalil's body, kneeling beside it, checking for pulse that no longer existed. He looked around frantically for help, calling out in accented Italian that someone had collapsed, medical assistance needed. 11:52 hours. Vatican medical staff responded to reports of a medical emergency in the chapel of the Pietà. They found Khalil's body, examined the wounds, and immediately understood this was not natural death. The senior medical officer ordered the chapel sealed. Swiss guards established perimeter, preventing entry while Vatican officials were notified. By 11:55 hours, the two operatives who had executed the shooting were 300 meters from Vatican territory, cassocks already removed and stuffed into a prepared disposal bag. They wore civilian clothing underneath. Transformation from clergy to tourists completed in under 40 seconds. A waiting vehicle departed the area at normal traffic speed, nothing to distinguish it from thousands of other cars moving through Rome on Easter Sunday. By 1200 hours, both shooters had reached a safe house in the Trastevere district, across the Tiber River from Vatican City. Debriefing began immediately. The weapon was disassembled, components separated for individual disposal in locations mapped weeks earlier. The cassocks were burned in an industrial incinerator, accessed through a contact in Rome's garment district. Forged credentials were destroyed. By 1400 hours, physical evidence connecting the operatives to the shooting had been eliminated systematically. The body was discovered officially at 12:08 hours when Vatican security completed initial assessment and confirmed homicide. Initial confusion dominated response protocols. Vatican City had not experienced a killing inside its borders in modern history. No established procedure existed for coordinating with Italian police on a sovereign territory murder investigation. Officials debated jurisdiction, evidence preservation, and notification protocols while Khalil's blood pooled on marble floors. Publicly, there was silence. Vatican press offices issued no statement that day. Italian media received no official confirmation. Rumors circulated through diplomatic channels, whispered conversations among embassy staff who heard fragments from Vatican contacts. But nothing appeared in newspapers. Television broadcasts made no mention. The institutional impulse was containment, managing a crisis that threatened to expose Vatican vulnerability. Privately, diplomatic channels lit up with encrypted traffic. The Holy See contacted Italian foreign ministry officials, demanding investigation while simultaneously asserting sovereign authority over the crime scene. Israel was approached through back channels, questions asked without formal accusations. Did Israeli intelligence have any knowledge of foreign operatives inside Vatican territory? The responses were carefully calibrated denials, neither confirming nor denying involvement, offering cooperation in abstract terms that committed to nothing concrete. Syria accused foreign powers of violating international law and sacred neutrality. Statements issued through state media that named no specific nation but implied Israeli responsibility through context. These accusations carried no evidentiary support, just strategic assumptions based on operational logic. Who else would target a Palestinian bomb maker? Who else had both motive and capability to execute inside Vatican walls? The investigation that followed revealed the sophistication of operational planning through what it failed to find. Vatican security examined entry logs, discovering nothing anomalous. The clergy who had been present in the chapel that morning could not be located because they didn't exist as registered Vatican personnel. Forged credentials had been destroyed. Safe houses had been sanitized. The weapon was never recovered, its components distributed across Rome's Tiber River in locations where currents prevented systematic recovery. Italian forensic teams, granted limited access to the crime scene, extracted 2 bullets from Khalil's body. Ballistic analysis confirmed 7.65 millimeter rounds, consistent with multiple pistol models available through European arms markets. No unique striations identified a specific weapon. The suppressor, if used, left no recoverable trace. Witnesses who had been in the chapel provided contradictory descriptions of the clergy present, none detailed enough for meaningful composite sketches. Every lead ended in carefully constructed dead ends, suggesting operational sophistication that exceeded typical criminal planning. Intelligence professionals examining the evidence understood immediately this was state-level tradecraft. But understanding and proving were different thresholds. No government formally claimed responsibility. No intelligence service leaked operational details. The denials were transparent to those in the field. But transparency wasn't the point. Plausible deniability had been engineered into every layer of the operation. The strategic achievement was immediate and measurable. Planned attacks that had been linked to Khalil's technical expertise stalled or failed in the months following his death. A device discovered at Rome's Fiumicino airport in June 1979 contained timing mechanisms consistent with Khalil's earlier work, but showed assembly errors he would never have made, suggesting less capable hands had attempted to replicate his methods. Militant cells lost critical technical infrastructure, forced to develop new expertise or abandon operations requiring sophisticated explosives. Intelligence gained from the operation extended beyond the immediate target. The successful penetration of Vatican security demonstrated that deep cover impersonation could work in environments previously considered impenetrable. Tradecraft methodologies were updated across multiple agencies, incorporating lessons about sustained cover maintenance and exploitation of institutional trust. But these gains came with costs rarely calculated in strategic assessments. Relations with the Vatican deteriorated in ways that took years to repair. The Holy See increased security protocols, implementing credential verification systems that made future operations exponentially more difficult. European intelligence agencies tightened surveillance on religious institutions, a response that created friction with legitimate clergy and complicated diplomatic relationships built on mutual respect for religious neutrality. For the operatives themselves, consequences varied. Post-operation psychiatric evaluations revealed varying levels of psychological impact. One operative required extended counseling for what was described as identity disassociation, the difficulty of returning to authentic self after months of sustained false identity. Another left active service within 2 years, citing personal reasons that case files suggested were related to moral conflict about the operation. The legend drift that had been noted as operational risk proved to have longer-term effects than planners anticipated. The calculation made by Israeli intelligence was that operational success outweighed diplomatic cost and individual psychological toll. Remove one bomb maker, prevent multiple attacks, accept the price of violated sanctuary, and damage relationships with the Vatican. Whether this assessment proved correct depends on time frame examined. In the immediate term, attacks were prevented. In the longer term, precedent was established that sacred spaces were no longer assumed neutral in the covert war between intelligence services and militant networks. This precedent reshaped operational doctrine across multiple intelligence agencies over the following decades. The principle that sanctuary could be breached when necessity demanded became embedded in strategic planning. But it also triggered counter-adaptations. Militant groups increased internal security, implemented compartmentalization that made technical expertise less concentrated in single individuals. The cat-and-mouse evolution of intelligence tradecraft accelerated. Unintended consequences rippled through systems that depended on assumptions of neutrality. International law regarding diplomatic immunity and sovereign territory faced new ambiguities. If intelligence agencies could operate inside Vatican City, what other supposedly neutral spaces were vulnerable? Red Cross facilities? United Nations compounds? The answers remained unspoken, but understood, everywhere became potentially contested ground. The moral question at the operation's core refuses simple resolution. Was this prevention or desecration? One perspective argues operational necessity. Khalil was infrastructure enabling terrorism. His removal saved lives that bombs would have taken, and sanctuary exploited for militant logistics forfeits protection. This view accepts that rules must sometimes be violated to protect the broader system those rules were designed to maintain. The alternative perspective argues systematic erosion. When intelligence agencies exploit sacred spaces, they destroy the very concepts that make civilization possible. Sanctuary, neutrality, religious protection. These aren't obstacles to security, but foundations of it. Violate them operationally, even with justification, and the precedent makes everyone less safe. Faith institutions become targets. Neutral ground disappears. The rules that restrain violence crumble incrementally. Both arguments carry weight supported by specific facts. Khalil's bombs had killed civilians. His technical expertise enabled operations that targeted non-combatants. Removing him demonstrably disrupted planned attacks. A tactical success measurable in lives not lost. But the operational precedent also made religious institutions less trusted, neutral spaces less available, and international norms governing covert action more permissive of boundary violations. The answer reveals more about your worldview than about the operation itself. If you prioritize preventing immediate harm, the calculus favors action despite cost. If you prioritize maintaining systemic rules that prevent greater long-term chaos, the calculus demands restraint, even when targets exploit protection. What's your take on the central question? When enemies hide behind neutrality, should intelligence agencies breach sacred spaces to reach them? Or does doing so destroy the foundations that make security possible in the first place? Drop your perspective in the comments. If this story made you question assumptions about where lines should be drawn in covert action, hit that like button and share. The debate matters because these calculations continue happening in different contexts, with different targets, but always with the same fundamental tension between operational necessity and the rules we claim make us different from those we fight.